Aha! Hi guys, today we are painting zombie Cyclops. If you like to see the full painting tutorial, check the Patreon link in the video description. I start with the black part of the suit. I use thin layers of daemonette hide and black to sketch out the main planes of light. Usually, I use a matte varnish before painting black to diffuse the satin finish of my primer, but this time, for some reason, I decided not to. The problem with skipping that part is that it's way harder to differentiate the parts that have some wet paint on them from the parts that does not. I add more volume to the legs and the chest area since those are facing in an upward position. I cover the metallic object on the base as well, leaving some of the recess areas black so I won't get rid of the details. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but if you guys know, please comment below the video because I'm curious. If you'd like to, smooth out the blends with a glaze consistency, because that will make the next step a little bit easier. I start blending with black to curve back my gray areas. This will also diffuse the satin finish of my primer, so I can see which parts need more work a little bit better. I move my brush from the gray parts to the black areas, and before I'm touching the mini with the brush, I remove the excess from the brush on a paper towel so the glaze won't pull up on the surface and create some ring-like ugly textures. I continue the process with daemonette hide. I reduce the highlight areas immensely, and I use thin layers to build up the opacity of my highlights. It's basically layering, so you create smaller and smaller layer upon each other, so the part where you build up the layers will be the most opaque. If you are not sure how opaque your paint can get, use a base layer consistency and make a small dot on an area that needs to be highlighted. You can build up thin layers upon those dots, and you build up the opacity until they blend in with the rest of the layers. The trick is to use the same motion with your brush, moving it towards the areas that you like to highlight, so you'll create a smooth gradient from the shadow areas. After that, I cover the stripes of the suit with alaitoc blue. I use thinner consistency over the shadow areas and a more opaque one over the highlight areas to create a fast gradient. The highlight areas need to line up with our gray highlights to be consistent, and if you can leave a very tiny black line between the gray and blue parts for more definition, then do it. If it's too challenging, you can come back later with a black line between these areas. Now back to the suit to push the contrast a bit more with slaanesh gray. As you noticed, I'm jumping between the suit, skin and the base. The reason I do this because it's hard to tell how much contrast I need with the black suit next to the other parts, but in order to make the rest of the black parts appear darker, I had to push the contrast of the suit with higher values like this gray. You can choose any shades of grey for these highlights, but I like these desaturated purple greys because they make the blue stripes more saturated next to them. I'm switching between base layer and the thin layer consistency to make some quick blends on the go. I try to add more detail to the leg muscles, and don't worry if your legs are appearing more greyish than black, because those parts are facing completely up towards our light source, so they can be highlighted a little bit more with more volume. The other area of focus is the chest and the abs, where you need to add a bit more volume with this value. I also highlight the NMM parts of the suit, like the belt and the visor on the head. Since I already covered those areas with a lower value grey, I pick out some details over one side of each belt piece and painted the major shapes of the visor. The visor itself is a half-thin slice of a cylinder, and the buttons on the both ends is a top slice of a sphere, so my highlight placement will follow those shapes. After that, I muted back my highlights on the black part of the suit with a mix of black and daemonette hide. I glazed this over the recent slaanesh grey highlights because I felt like the volume of them is a little bit bigger than I intended. If you watched any of my videos where I paint black, I do this basically every time. Since we are painting minis, we have very little surface to work with, and to have a desired mid-tone, we need to have that mid-tone to be present for at least 40–50% over the mini. Since most of the areas on the front are highlighted due to their angle, it's easy to over-highlight the miniature a little bit, but it's nothing we can't fix by glazing some of the lower value grey we used as the first highlight. And if that's not enough, I go back with black as well, but I don't glaze that over my highlights, only my shadow tones and shadow halftones. I highlighted the blue parts of the suit with a mix of alaitoc blue and temple guard blue. I sketched these highlights over the thighs and collar area, and I did some edge highlights off camera as well, since it was very hard for me to do it on camera. The highlights have to be aligned with the grey highlights to be consistent, and once I'm done with the sketching, I go in and thin down my paint to a glaze to blend in this color.
Come out to play. Oh, in this nightfall waltz we spin, lost in time where hearts have been.
I previously painted the visor with burnt red, and now I paint a line over the center with vallejo red to build up the light beam that is coming out of the eyes. To enhance this effect, I mix some ice yellow to the vallejo red and paint the center of the previous layer to create this glow to the visor. I want to make the necrotic blisters more shiny so they could stand out more, and I paint a little dot over the top left half of each one and another one on the bottom right. Some of them are quite small, so I can only make one dot on those, but it's manageable to do 2 dots on the bigger ones. On the base, I started to highlight the big metal object. I used the same grays as I did for the character. On the ID card, this thing is more bluish than purple, but I think it would look alright with these purple shades too. The front of this object is a sphere, and the back is broken down into more polygon shapes with some cables hanging out. On the sphere, I'm creating a more round-shaped highlight, and on the small polygons, I create a simple gradient. On the cables, I follow the cylinder shapes on the bigger cable with the joints, and on the smaller ones, I highlight them as a whole.
Where whispered dreams take flight. With a sigh, the night begins. Softly playing violins, your hand in mine, a gentle sway.
Now I shape the highlight over the sphere part like a half ring shape, and I use thin layers to smooth out the blend. I picked out the center of the sphere because there is a round center part on the ID card, so I thought I could replicate that to add a little bit more detail to this object. I also edge highlight over all the edges that stand out from the general shape. Since I didn't use this value over the visor, now it's time to add more detail and reduce the highlight areas even more. For blending, I thin down the paint more and apply a few layers over the areas I'd like to blend.
By the flicker of candlelight's charm, I feel safely within your arm. A melody that softly croons as we twirl to silence.
For my last highlight, I use ice yellow. In general, I like to use thin layers for my last highlights, since those are easier to blend in, but when I switch to edge highlights, I always use a thicker consistency for more control. I add some details over the belt, picking out the sides of these little joint parts, and paint the maximum highlights over the visor inside my previous layers. As the highlights are built up, you can see that the light is a little bit more intense over the left side of the face, and the visor highlights are aligned with these volumes.
Give you a wink with cheeks so soft it makes you think how life goes by in a blink. But Granny's love is the strongest link.
I mix some yellow ochre to the bloodreaver flesh to paint the base. I cover each rock from the left side and leave a little bit of shadow area over the right side if we look at these rocks from the front. I leave some recessed shadows between each rock to make them more separated and to have more definition. I add some ice yellow to the mix and add more detail to these parts by adding more angles to the rock shapes. This increases the depth of these little rocks and make the base more interesting looking overall. I'm focusing more on the left side again to keep up the consistency in the highlight placement over the base, and since we are using similar tones for the highlight, it also creates an integrated look. I add a little bit more ice yellow to the mix to push the contrast over the edges of the left side of the rocks. This makes them more rocky looking in a way. As a finishing touch, I went back to the head and created a shiny dot with a mix of slaanesh grey and ice yellow to enhance my focal point a little bit more. With that, Cyclops is done and ready for the table. Thank you guys for watching, and if you are interested in PDF tutorials for other characters of the game that won't receive a video guide, consider joining my Patreon page. A huge thanks to my patrons who support these kind of videos, with special shout out to Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mausner, Glitchy MacCrash, Penoman45, Michael Kerr, Gerard Krish, and Adam Holt. And as always, I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.